Good morning, everyone. To begin the webinar, we have Rick Wilson, Manager of Data and Analytics from Conservation Ontario, to share a land acknowledgement. Rick?
Thanks, Cameron. Good morning. On behalf of the Latornell Steering Committee and today's presenters, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that although we have attendees from across Ontario and beyond joining us virtually today, we're all gathered here on what is known as Turtle Island. In particular, I'd like to honor and recognize the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Cree, Métis people, and others who have resided in the basin of the Great Lakes for many generations. We deeply appreciate the relationship, both past and ongoing, that Indigenous nations have with these lands and waters, and acknowledge the Indigenous practices of land stewardship, which have created and sustained these waters, these clean waters and vibrant ecosystems that benefit all of our lives. In the spirit of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, we recognize our responsibility to protect and steward the environment for future generations. We appreciate sharing these responsibilities as land stewards and are committed to building new and strengthened relationships moving forward. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I encourage you all to take a moment to consider where you are physically situated and acknowledge the land and Indigenous people that share it.
Great. Thank you for that important message, Rick. I'm Cam Irvin, member of the Latornell Steering Committee and Sub-Watershed Planning Coordinator at the Grand River Conservation Authority. On behalf of the committee, Conservation Ontario, and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you all to the first Latornell webinar of 2024. There's many assessment initiatives in the Great Lakes region at various scales with various reporting purposes. How are they all linked together? What do they tell us? And what can we do to improve an assessment? This webinar is going to focus on both binational and Canada-only initiatives in the Great Lakes region. We have 5 presentations today scheduled, starting with the regional scale work done by Ontario's conservation authorities and moving up to the scale of Great Lakes. The presentations will be concluded by a discussion around integration and some key takeaway messages. Following this, we will invite the speakers to engage in a Q&A session where participants will have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A box. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. First, to all of our attendees, you're all muted and will not be able to speak or come on video. You'll find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. At any time during the webinar, I encourage you to type questions into the box and press enter to have it posted. You may direct questions at individual presenters or to the panel as a whole, but please indicate which presenter your question is directed to. You can upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up button, and we will be reviewing questions and have time at the end to pose them to our panelists following their presentations during the discussion period. Feel free to interact with others throughout the webinar through the chat box. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you're not speaking, and of course, to unmute yourself when you are. This webinar is being recorded so that others who are not able to attend will be able to listen in when they can. And before I introduce our panelists, let's take a look at the results of our polls. So the first question, in which Great Lake watershed do you reside? It looks like a majority of us are joining from Lake Ontario watershed with 57%. Then there's a fair mix between Lake Huron, Lake Erie, several folks from outside the Great Lakes watershed, a few from Lake Superior and Lake Michigan, and several that are unsure. That's okay. Hopefully, after today's presentations, you'll know. The second question was, what is your organization affiliation? We have about a third of us from conservation authorities, and then good representation through other sectors, including municipalities, NGOs, federal government, provincial government, state government, and several students, private sector as well, all around 10% or so. The third question was, which of the following assessments are you familiar with? So it's good to see that a lot of us are familiar with several of the assessments that we're going to be discussing today. And if you're not familiar with some of those assessments, hopefully after today's presentations, you will be. So 76% are familiar with the Conservation Authority watershed report cards. And then it looks like with the others, there was at least 25% of us were familiar with some of the other assessments, ranging up to 50% familiar with the state of the Great Lakes. So that's great. Now, our first speaker today is Loveleen Clayton from Credit Valley Conservation. Loveleen is the manager of ecosystem and climate change strategies at Credit Valley Conservation. She graduated from the University of Guelph in their first year of the environmental science program and has been at CVC ever since. She's been involved in CVC's integrated watershed monitoring program since its creation in 1999, starting as a field lead, and is now managing the program. Loveleen is the current co-chair of the Conservation Ontario Watershed Report Card Working Group and is presenting today on the group's behalf. Welcome, Loveleen, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Just a minute. There we go.
Okay, yep, we can see your presentation.
Wonderful. So, morning, everyone. My name is Loveleen, and I'm the manager of ecosystem science and climate change strategies at Credit Valley Conservation. And I'm presenting today as the co-chair of the Conservation Authority Watershed Report Card Working Group. So in my presentation, I will discuss the scale at which Conservation Authority watershed report cards take place, who is involved in the development of those report cards, what is a Conservation Authority watershed report card, what indicators we use in our assessments, what formats we share the results, and I'll share a brief overview of the latest results. And then lastly, a little bit about our next steps as an organization. So as some of you may be aware, the province of Ontario has 36 conservation authorities across the province. Conservation authorities are local watershed management agencies spread across Ontario with a heavy presence in central and southern Ontario. Their purpose is to undertake watershed-based programs to protect people and property from flooding and other natural hazards, drinking water source protection, and to conserve natural resources for economic, social, and environmental benefits. A unique aspect of conservation authorities is that their boundaries are shaped by the watershed and not political boundaries. This is evident by the squiggly outlines of each watershed on the map. Conservation Ontario is an umbrella nonprofit organization that represents all 36 conservation authorities. So who is involved in the creation and production of these watershed report cards? Conservation Ontario coordinates the watershed report card process, and they create the guidelines and templates for all conservation authorities to follow. And they also roll up the results to a provincial scale. Conservation authorities collect and summarize the data, produce the CA report cards, and share the summarized data with Conservation Ontario for their roll-up. And staff representatives also attend regular working group meetings to stay updated on the process and ask questions or clarification. The working group has two co-chairs. One is myself, and the other is Ian Ockenden from Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority. And some conservation authorities also volunteer to join sub-working groups as subject matter experts in the fields of surface water quality, groundwater quality, forest conditions, communications, GIS, and data analysis. We have a strong partnership with the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. They have programs such as the Provincial Water Quality Monitoring Network and the Provincial Groundwater Monitoring Network that provides us with a vast array of surface water and groundwater sites across the province, the equipment to collect the data, the lab support to analyze the data, and just overall technical support. They also have the Ontario benthic Biomonitoring Network that provides a provincial standard for collecting benthic monitoring data. So I just wanted to share some numbers regarding the incredible number of monitoring sites that are supported by the strong partnership with the MECP across Ontario. There's 656 groundwater monitoring sites, 976 surface water monitoring sites, and 802 benthic monitoring sites. So what is a watershed report card? Well, it's an important tool to share information about the state of local watershed conditions. We aim to capture a wide audience, including residents, agencies, researchers, and government partners. The report provides a snapshot of watershed conditions every 5 years. And as I mentioned before, Conservation Ontario also rolls the results up for a snapshot of conditions across the province. Each conservation authority that produces a report card follows the same booklet style format, and they are all available online. The first set of report cards were released in 2013, and for most conservation authorities, including Credit Valley Conservation, the 2023 version will be their third watershed report card. It is worth noting that some CAs collect more data beyond the indicators of the watershed report card. However, these report cards represent a standard base level of reporting across the province to tell a whole story at a much larger scale. There are three resource categories that are assessed in each report card. Surface water quality includes phosphorus, E. coli, and benthic macroinvertebrates. Groundwater quality includes nitrate plus nitrite and chlorides. Forest conditions includes percent forest cover, percent forest interior, and percent streamside vegetation. These categories and their indicators were chosen to represent the minimum standard data available for the majority of CAs across Ontario. Now, some CAs have less resources than others, so we focused on a set of indicators that are available at a provincial scale. In 2003, we decided to add a fourth focus for the Conservation Ontario story map, surface water chlorides. Individual conservation authorities could add this indicator to their report cards as well. Chlorides is known to be an important issue across Ontario, particularly as it relates to road salt, drinking water, and contributions to our aquatic ecosystem. So how do we share the results? So as I mentioned, conservation authorities follow the short, visually appealing booklet style format. They share the latest report card on their websites, and Conservation Ontario also shares these report cards via their website at watershedcheckup.ca. Conservation Ontario produces a story map, which you can find at stateofontariowatersheds.ca. At the individual conservation authority scale, the booklet style has the same template and has 9 pages. The template includes a cover page, a map locating where this watershed is found in Ontario, why we monitor, and the classification system. 3 pages of the resource category results, surface water quality, groundwater quality, and forest conditions, showing the overall letter grade for their watershed in the top right-hand corner of the page, and displaying the results by subwatershed in the map at the bottom. There is then a page that is up to each CA to highlight a specific indicator or result tailored to their watershed, such as wetlands or surface water chlorides. A page is also dedicated to an important result or stressor in their local watershed, such as wetlands, urban land use change, or stormwater. There's also a call to action page that shares what conservation authorities and others are doing or can do to improve watershed health conditions, and then a contact page. And so how do we share the results through Conservation Ontario? Conservation Ontario receives all of the summarized grades from each conservation authority and rolls them up into a visually appealing story map. And this is what the cover page looks like. The story map provides an overview of the stressors and conditions in our watershed. It then describes each resource category, the threats associated with it, maps showing the results across the province, and actions we can all take to improve the conditions. And at the bottom of the page here is a sample map on surface water quality conditions from that story map. If you go to watershedcheckup.ca, you can either find the individual conservation authority report cards, or you can look at the story map that rolls up the results across the province. And much like the 2018 watershed report cards, the 2023 report cards revealed lower grades in surface water quality and forest conditions. Groundwater conditions are generally A's and B's, where the A's and B's are generally in watersheds with less urban pressures, especially in the north and eastern part of the province. I encourage you to check the website for more detailed results in a watershed that you are interested in. A good practice for any program is to regularly look for efficiencies and improvements, and the Watershed Report Card Working Group is no different. We started what we call an audacious ideas list, where members of the working group can provide ideas for the next round of report cards and identify any potential barriers to implementation. The sub-working groups with the subject matter experts are exploring ideas in this audacious ideas list, reviewing the indicators, and considering improvements to future iterations of the report card. That way, we are prepared for the next round of report cards in 2028. So check out watershedcheckup.ca and let us know what you think. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Loveleen, for that great overview on the reporting work that CAs are doing in Ontario. Our next presenters are Mary Bellissimo and Anders Holder. Mary holds a Bachelor of Science from McMaster University in Biology and Environmental Science with a minor in GIS and a Master's of Environmental Science from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Her career with Environment and Climate Change Canada began as a student during the internship portion of her master's, where she worked with the nearshore team. Mary is currently continuing her work with the nearshore team as a physical scientist, completing the nearshore assessment, exploring the use of scripting tools to automate geospatial tasks, and using R to understand our data. Anders is a Great Lakes Program Officer with Environment and Climate Change Canada. He holds a Master of Environmental Science from the University of Toronto, where he studied conservation biology. Anders has led the development of the Canadian Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey, along with advancing our understanding of Great Lakes coastal wetlands concerning climate change resilience and adaptation. Currently, he is helping to coordinate the newly established Great Lakes Freshwater Ecosystem Initiative, where he will oversee projects that increase the resilience of Great Lakes coastal wetlands to climate-related risks and impacts and other stressors. Passing it on to Mary and Anders.
All right. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Bellissimo, and I'm a physical scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I will be presenting the Canadian Great Lakes Nearshore Assessment today. So first, I would like to begin by discussing some policy to provide background of why the nearshore framework exists. So the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was first signed in 1972, is a binational commitment between the United States and Canada to restore and protect the waters of the Great Lakes through 10 annexes. So in 2012, the agreement was updated to enhance water quality programs and included the nearshore framework, which is under Annex 2, otherwise known as the Lake-wide Annex. As well, the Canada-Ontario Agreement also supports the restoration and protection of the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem, and the agreement outlines how the Government of Canada and the Province of Ontario will cooperate and coordinate their efforts to restore and protect and conserve the Great Lakes Basin ecosystem. So the purpose of the nearshore framework is to identify areas in the nearshore under high cumulative stress, or areas that are of high ecological value, in order to establish priorities for nearshore protection, restoration, and prevention, which will then support social, cultural, recreational, and economic benefits. So this map on the screen shows the extent of the nearshore. So the nearshore waters are basically where the land meets the lake. They are a source of drinking water for most communities within the basin, and are the areas of the lakes where most human recreation occurs, and are the critical ecological link between watersheds and the open waters of the Great Lakes. So many different agencies and programs define the nearshore in their own terms. But for us, the scope of the nearshore framework includes the nearshore waters and embayments along the coast of the Canadian Great Lakes and connecting river systems. We also aim to consider the relationship between the zone of influence and the zone of impact. And the nearshore is generally defined as areas where waters are subject to direct influences from watersheds. So this map shows our regional units, and those are the lateral boundaries that define, those are the lateral boundaries that define from the onshore and offshore. So the historical high water mark was used for the onshore boundary, and the offshore boundary was determined by lake depth. So for example, Lake Erie, which is the shallowest of the Great Lakes, has an offshore boundary of a depth of 15 meters. But in contrast, Lake Superior, which is the biggest of the Great Lakes, has a 100-meter offshore depth boundary. And then these lateral boundaries that separate each into regional units were determined using substrate data, shoreline morphology, and wave energy. This resulted in 64 regional units across the Canadian Great Lakes. So this regional unit scale was used so people on the coast can see impacts at a regional scale to inform local action by communities that exist within each regional unit. So how is cumulative stress assessed? So the nearshore assessment used the 9 objectives in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to guide the development of the measures you see on the left side of the screen. This resulted in 4 categories, with each category containing 3 measures. So for instance, the coastal processes category contains the 3 measures: shoreline hardening, tributary connectivity, and littoral barriers. So each measure has its own specific methodology to determine stress from the use of data that came from the federal and provincial governments, open source data, and our partners, including NOAA. So once each of the 3 measures receives their stress score, they are rolled up to provide a category score. Once each category receives its stress score, they are rolled up again to provide an overall regional unit cumulative stress score. So this approach allows us to identify specific threats to the nearshore area that are or may become subject to high stress due to the cumulative impacts of our 12 measures. Since we are assessing different aspects of the ecosystem health, we needed to figure out how to integrate data into a single assessment. So we decided to use a weight of evidence approach. The weight of evidence approach allowed us to integrate multiple data sets of different forms and weigh some measures higher based on their strength, relevance, and reliability to the assessment. So this chart on the left side of the screen with the yellow, orange, gray, and red colors shows how the weight of evidence worked. So if 2 categories were under low stress and 2 were under moderate stress, then the overall regional unit score is moderate stress. But in contrast, if 1 category had a score of low stress and 3 categories had a score of high stress, the overall regional unit score would also be high stress. So this map shows the results of the first iteration of the nearshore assessment, which took place over a 5-year period. This was done by tackling a lake every year. So in 2018, Lake Erie was assessed, in 2019, Lake Ontario, in 2020, Lake Superior, and in 2021, Lake Huron. And we are currently doing the reiteration for Lake Erie. Of the 64 regional units, 3 are under high stress. 2 of those units are seen in Lake Erie and include Point Pelee East and Rondo East, and 1 in Lake Ontario, which includes Hamilton Harbor. 51 regional units are under moderate stress, 9 regional units are under low stress, and 1 regional unit is under very low stress, and that is Lake Huron, South Manitoulin Island. In addition to identifying these varying levels of cumulative stress, the nearshore assessment helped to identify major threats at a lake-wide scale. For example, the impact of shoreline hardening, shore perpendicular structures, and dams that impede tributary connectivity have the ability to impair coastal processes and may be a threat to Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and the southern shore of Lake Huron. Areas where these impacts are most severe are helping us prioritize restoration and protection actions. Now, another aspect of the nearshore framework was to identify areas of high ecological value. This was done by doing a collaborative mapping exercise that included expertise and values of multidisciplinary groups across the Great Lakes. Examples of ecosystem aspects considered included specific biophysical attributes, uniqueness, naturalness, sensitivity, and importance of species at risk, and geodiversity. So by overlaying the cumulative stress in areas of high ecological values, we can better prioritize protection and restoration actions that lead to improved water quality and ecosystem health in the nearshore. The results of the nearshore assessment are intended to drive action. Here are just a few examples of how the results of the assessment had led to action by various partners and agencies. I would just like to highlight one on coastal processes. So when it comes to coastal processes, shoreline alteration, and littoral barriers, nearshore ecosystems are under threat from the loss of coastal resiliency. This means that the ecosystem cannot bounce back when faced with change the way they once could. So the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority and the Maitland Valley Conservation Authority are engaging communities in community-scale restoration and protection activities supported by up-to-date coastal science in order to improve nearshore health. The reports that are produced showing the results of the assessment include the lake-wide action and management plans, which you will hear more about this morning from my colleague Gurpreet. Environment and Climate Change Canada open data portal, which contains various reports and spatial layers. And the actually my map, if you want to have a look at the spatial layers and don't have access to ARC desktop products. So the assessment will be repeated to measure progress over time, and will adapt when new methods or science become available wherever possible. We hope that this is just the start of the conversation, and we continue to work toward a healthy nearshore together. Thank you.
Good morning. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looks good.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Xander Holderd. I'm a Great Lakes Program Officer with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I'm here today to present to you an overview of our Canadian Baseline Coastal Habitat Survey for the Great Lakes. I first would like to acknowledge the tremendous efforts for which this wouldn't be possible from our task team, which includes members from Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and Fisheries and Oceans Canada. I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight how vast, varied, and beautiful the Canadian Great Lakes coastal margin is. From the large contiguous forest cover and extensive network of high-quality lakes and rivers in the upper Great Lakes, the North Channel and northeastern Georgian Bay with the iconic landscape, unique rock barrens, and many high-quality coastal wetlands, down to the Bruce with some of the oldest trees in eastern North America, as well as globally rare alvars, and high-quality nearshore waters that attract hundreds of thousands of tourists each year. And in the glacial tilt to the south, which provides nourishing sands to some of the world's longest freshwater beaches, spits, and dune systems. And here also, the soils sustain about 25% of Canada's agricultural productivity. These habitats and many others are of local, provincial, national, and international importance. And it's no wonder that the Great Lakes Basin supports one of the most diverse ecoregions in North America, and the greatest diversity of species in Canada, with approximately 3,500 species calling the Great Lakes region home. But unfortunately, the Great Lakes region is part of a global loss of habitats and species. So the introduction of over 180 non-native species have led to the replacement of key habitats, native species, and food web changes. Hundreds of dams and barriers have altered water flow and aquatic habitat connectivity. This is impacting fish habitat, fish production, transfer of soil, sediments, plants, and invertebrates. Point and non-point source pollution continue to impact water quality, and the cumulative impact of these threats and pressures are particularly challenging, which is resulting in the estimated losses of over 70% of our current wetlands. And in some areas in southern Ontario, this number exceeds 90%. Also, much of our forests, grasslands have been replaced with urban and rural development, particularly in the south. And so these critical threats to biodiversity are widely accepted, but do differ in their extent and severity depending on where on the landscape they occur. So since we cannot protect what we don't know exists, under both the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the Canada-Ontario Agreement, we were charged with conducting a baseline survey of existing habitat against which to establish a Great Lakes Basin ecosystem target of net habitat gain and to measure future progress. Despite extensive efforts to restore and protect the Great Lakes coastal ecosystem by many agencies, organizations, and stewardship groups, governments have not yet established a method to measure progress at achieving net gain in habitat. So to accomplish this, we developed a baseline habitat survey with the goal of providing a standardized tools and methodology to survey existing habitat and measure progress over time. And the survey results would be provided via open access to enable governments, environmental and non-governmental organizations, and local stewardship groups to establish these results, to establish local targets, identify priority places, to restore, enhance, create, and protect habitat, as well as evaluate conservation success. So how did we do it? The general goal was to develop a standardized and repeatable methodology to quantitatively assess and report on habitat. And our team of scientists set out to develop and apply new tools and frameworks for inventorying and classification. And we wanted to make this information widely available and assist in establishing a benchmark. Ultimately, the hope is education, improved awareness, and capacity building leads to more conservation action. So for our study area, we captured the entire Canadian Great Lakes coastal margin, and this consists of from the shoreline to approximately 2 kilometers inland and spanning from the US border in Lake Superior all the way down to the Quebec border in the St. Lawrence River. And this amounts to about 8,500 kilometers of coastal habitat, totaling over 1 million hectares that was analyzed and summarized across the 4 Canadian Great Lakes. For context, that's about half the size of Vermont, about twice the size of PEI, and the same length as the Canada-US border. So similar to other planning and assessment initiatives, we split the coastal margin into like habitat units based on their parent geology, soil, vegetation, and watershed hydrology. For example, here we have Lake Huron. The basin was broken down into 17 coastal units. And while this makes sense for reporting, these units are also influenced by different land-based and lake stressors and threats that can be tracked over time. And it's important to note, though, that the spatial data that we created can be sliced and diced and analyzed at any scale that meets your own needs and interests. Our survey focused on 4 main habitat types that have been identified as key biodiversity conservation targets over the many years of lake-wide planning. To some extent, they are the focus of other management efforts such as lake environmental objectives, lake-wide action and management plans, and provincial and binational science and monitoring. So focal habitats for the survey were shorelines and uplands, inland and coastal wetlands, tributary and tributary riparian areas, and to a lesser extent, inland lakes and ponds. Additionally, we have a 5th category, which we title the coastal landscape, and this was created for measures that encompass all habitat types and assess the interactions that occur within and among the different habitat types, such as protected lands and restored habitat. So given our goal of net habitat gain, the survey was analyzed across 6 components, which could be used in future reassessments to measure progress and set targets. For the purpose of this survey, net habitat gain is defined as an increase in extent of habitat, an increase in diversity, an improvement in ecological condition, an enhancement of ecological function, an increase in protected lands and waters, and the restoration of habitat. And so across the 4 lakes, an average of 20 measures were used as surrogates for establishing this baseline. So in the interest of time, I'm providing a high-level summary of the results of the survey. So along the entire Canadian Great Lakes coastal margin, 53% was comprised of uplands, which includes beaches, forests, and meadows. 30% is comprised of human land use, which includes urban and rural development, roads, and agriculture. 14% is comprised of wetlands, which is both inland and coastal, and 4% is inland lakes and ponds. And additionally, the shoreline is predominantly natural, with the majority of hardened and altered shorelines occurring in the lower lakes or in major cities in the upper lakes. Diversity of habitat and species varies lake by lake, but along the entire Canadian Great Lakes coastal margin, 76% is comprised of uplands, 20% is comprised of wetlands, and the 2% is comprised of inland lakes and ponds. From the Carolean forest in the south to all the way up to the boreal forest in the north, there are over 740 species of conservation concern along this coastal margin, of which 118 are designated as species at risk. A detailed survey of each lake has been conducted, and the results are summarized by both discrete coastal units and lake-wide. And the results allow for regional and local conservation groups to use this information to identify conservation needs, opportunities for habitat protection, restoration, and enhancement. I'd like to briefly show you the resolution of the geospatial information available within our data catalog. So as an example, here is Port Franks, located just south of the Pinery Provincial Park on the southeastern shores of Lake Huron. So one of our first steps when we open the data catalog is to use our Great Lakes Shoreline Ecosystem layer to understand the breadth of coverage available. And so this is using ArcGIS Pro, just for context. So by displaying the polygons by community class, we can see where the variety of habitat types are within the survey area. And it is at this scale that we can obtain our measures of extent, but we can break these polygons down further to isolate select habitat types. So for example, I have broken down the wetlands further to see the diversity of ecosites within the area. I'll now add additional layers that can be included in the data catalog to better understand what we're looking at. The first is a point file, which shows where our rare plant communities exist along the landscape, followed by the protected and conserved areas, and the riparian vegetation, and Phragmites. And so next we'll add human land use components. So to do this, I added an additional GLSE or Great Lakes Shoreline Ecosystem layer and focused on the anthropogenic land polygons or human land use polygons. And as well as I added the shoreline hardening layer. And this allows the users to see where the shoreline armoring and residential development has occurred. And while each layer provides its own valuable information, you can see how the inclusion of multiple layers helps identify potential areas of interest. This is just a quick example of the many layers available in the data catalog. And so while the survey data and results respond to our commitments and our agreements, they also provide many benefits to the conservation community. The information can be used to improve management decision-making, as the data represents the latest approach to classify and inventory coastal habitat, which improves our understanding of the type, extent, and diversity, and therefore resilience of the existing habitat. The data can aid in research and monitoring through partnerships and collaborations, such as identifying high-quality habitats. And this work can advance community-based action through improving awareness, building local capacity, and advancing local stewardship initiatives, and can also lend credibility to funding applications. Additionally, there are cultural and spiritual benefits, as the results can be used to share knowledge and inspire appreciation for nature, and in doing so, improve a greater connection to the natural world. So the results of the Canadian Baseline Habitat Survey are produced in both technical reports and spatial data by lake. So each technical report provides the current quantitative information and describes the data sources, assembly, and geospatial processing required to repeat the analysis, and establishes a standardized approach for future replication to track net habitat gain and/or loss. Lake Erie is currently available, and the subsequent lakes will be available shortly. Additionally, each lake's spatial data results are now available on the Government of Canada's Open Data Portal and contain two files: shape files of each measure, which enable users to view, analyze, and manipulate the information spatially and/or export and view in tabular format, as I showed in the example previously. And as well, we provide a KMZ format for people who do not have access to ArcGIS or any geospatial mapping products. And this can be opened in Google Earth or a similar product to explore the data. So now that we've completed the baseline habitat survey, what's next? So the results are being used to support the State of the Great Lakes reporting by contributing to both the coastal wetland extent and the hardened shoreline sub-indicator. We are planning to use the results of the survey to help review prospective projects for our new funding program, the Great Lakes Freshwater Ecosystem Initiative, specifically on restoring and protecting coastal areas. And in addition, both the results and the geographic scope and scale are currently being used to advance our identification of priority areas for conservation, protection, and restoration. In terms of next steps, we are also planning on updating components of the survey using the province's natural resource inventory and change monitoring process to determine land cover changes along the coastal margin since the survey was completed. Focus will be placed on identifying changes in coastal wetlands. So thank you for your time today. For more information, please feel free to reach out and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you to both Mary and Anders for sharing that insightful work on the nearshore assessment and the baseline habitat survey. And if there's any questions, we can get to them in the discussion afterwards. Our next speaker is Jacob Orlandi. Jacob is a devoted physical science officer working with the State of the Great Lakes Reporting Unit at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Jacob holds a Bachelor of Environmental Studies as well as a Diploma in Ecological Restoration and Rehabilitation from the University of Waterloo. Since joining Environment and Climate Change Canada as a co-op student in 2016, Jacob has been passionate about building a career focused on protecting and restoring the water quality and ecosystem health of the Great Lakes. He's had the privilege of working with various partners, including binational research scientists, local stakeholders, and Indigenous communities to communicate the results of scientific work on the Great Lakes. Jacob is committed to utilizing his experience and skills to ensure that the ecological conditions of the Great Lakes are well communicated to concerned citizens and decision makers alike. Jacob, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Can you see my screen okay? It should be showing the presentation there, the first slide.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks everyone so much for tuning into my portion of the presentation today. It's an honor to be speaking here today. My name is Jacob Orlandi, and I'm a physical science officer with the State of the Great Lakes Reporting Unit of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And today I'll be delivering a presentation focused on how we assess the health of the Great Lakes through the State of the Great Lakes reporting. And sorry, Cameron, I just want to note, I'm trying to share my video to show me, but it's saying you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Is it possible to allow me to start my video?
We'll look into that.
Okay, I think it's...
Okay, I can see you now.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Okay, so the 2012 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement commits Canada and the United States to maintain science-based ecosystem indicators to assess the state of the Great Lakes and use those indicators to report on basin-wide and lake-specific conditions every 3 years. And this is done through the issuing of a new iteration of the State of the Great Lakes report every 3 years. And this is led by Environment and Climate Change Canada and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The most recent iteration of the State of the Great Lakes report was released in 2022, and this report, as well as the 900+ page technical report and user-friendly microsite, can be found on binational.net. So for my presentation today, I'll be focusing on the reporting process and scientific assessment results of the 2022 State of the Great Lakes report. The next iteration of the State of the Great Lakes report is scheduled to be released in the summer of 2025. So there are 9 indicators that we use in the State of the Great Lakes report to give us a clearer picture on how the Great Lakes are doing. And these indicators assess key water quality and ecosystem health conditions, and I'll go through these in more detail shortly. Now, this slide here provides a high-level overview of the key steps that were taken for creating the 2022 State of the Great Lakes report. So over 200 Great Lakes scientists and experts authored or contributed to 40 different sub-indicator reports. The experts hailed from 41 Great Lakes agencies and organizations, and the reports used over 100 Great Lakes datasets. Now, these 40 sub-indicator reports use these datasets to assess the status and trends of ecosystem components in all 5 Great Lakes, as well as the Great Lakes overall. Status assessments of either good, fair, or poor were determined comparing conditions to numeric targets, and the trends for the most recent 10-year periods are assessed as improving, unchanging, deteriorating, or undetermined. And the information in the 40 sub-indicator reports was used to assess the 9 Great Lakes indicators, and these assessments formed the 2022 State of the Great Lakes report. Now, this slide here provides a visualization of the entire geographic scope of the Great Lakes Basin. And although the assessments through the State of the Great Lakes reporting are focused on the waters of the Great Lakes, in some cases we need to consider activities happening throughout the entire basin, as these activities that happen on land can have an impact on the water quality of the Great Lakes. And this slide here just visualizes the vast number of agencies and organizations that were involved in the State of the Great Lakes 2022 reporting process. So at this point here, I'm going to share a brief video that provides a little bit further information on the process that was taken to draft the 2022 State of the Great Lakes report.
The The Great Lakes are a vast, incredible, and essential resource as a very diverse ecosystem with globally rare and unique species. Containing 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water supply, they provide drinking water to approximately 28 million Canadians and Americans, habitats to over 3,500 plant and animal species throughout the region, and are important to the economies of both Canada and the United States. In 2012, the Canadian and U.S. governments revised the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, committing to protect and restore the Great Lakes through monitoring, implementing action, and reporting on the health of the ecosystem and its components. The agreement states that the State of the Great Lakes report should be updated and released tri-annually and should describe basin-wide environmental trends and lake-specific conditions using ecosystem indicators established by Canada and the U.S. There are 9 of these ecosystem indicators, and each of them correspond to one of the 9 general objectives outlined in the agreement. Every indicator consists of one or more sub-indicators that contribute to its overall assessment. Each sub-indicator has a report authored by scientific experts who analyze the status of the ecosystem component and assess it as either good, fair, or poor. The trend is also analyzed and assessed as either improving, unchanging, or deteriorating. The process of developing and releasing the State of the Great Lakes reports involves an important technical review of the sub-indicator reports once written, where experts representing over 25 Great Lakes agencies and organizations offer input and insights on the science and assessment to ensure the highest degree of scientific integrity. These reports benefit the public, decision makers, and technical experts alike by educating and engaging on the importance of the science stemming from the Great Lakes and everything they impact. The State of the Great Lakes reports highlight established science, providing us with vital information to better protect this essential ecosystem for generations to come.
Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of how the assessment process works, I'm going to jump into to share information on the actual assessments for each indicator from the State of the Great Lakes 2022 report. So the first indicator is drinking water, and it's used to answer the question, can we drink the water? The answer is yes, the Great Lakes remain a source of high quality drinking water when treated. Now, the drinking water indicator is supported by one sub-indicator, and that is the treated drinking water sub-indicator, and it's shown here in this table. And this sub-indicator assesses the quality of municipally treated water. And for the Canadian assessment, data from the Ontario Drinking Water Information System show that treated drinking water meets provincial standards the vast majority of the time. However, localized exceedances can sometimes occur. Generally, the Great Lakes are a source of safe drinking water for approximately 28 million people in Canada and the United States. And at this time, this sub-indicator does not include data from Canadian Indigenous drinking water systems. However, we are hoping to address this significant data gap in future reporting. We're working towards that. Overall, the status of the drinking water indicator for the Great Lakes is assessed as good, and the 10-year trend, based on Ontario data only for the sub-indicator, is unchanging. The next indicator is beaches, and it is used to answer, can we swim at the beach? The answer to this question is yes, most Great Lakes monitored beaches are open and safe for swimming during the summer months. However, some beaches are occasionally unsafe for swimming due to bacterial contamination. The beaches indicator is supported by the beach advisory sub-indicator, which assesses beach water quality based on sampling results for E. coli, which is a fecal indicator bacteria. And elevated levels of E. coli can result in beach advisories, which are issued to prevent human health concerns. The assessment is based on data from over 700 monitored beaches binationally across the Great Lakes, and data from the Ontario Public Health Units is used for the Canadian portion of the assessment. Monitored Great Lakes beaches were within recreational water guidelines 90% of the time in Canada and an average of 94% of the time in the US during the 2018 to 2019 swimming seasons, thus leading to the overall good assessment for the sub-indicator. And the overall assessment for the beaches indicator is good and unchanging to improving. Moving to the fish consumption indicator, which is used to answer the question, can we eat the fish? The answer is generally yes. Great Lakes fish can be safely eaten when following consumption guidelines and advisories. However, unrestricted fish consumption is not possible, which has a greater impact on communities that heavily rely on fish for food and cultural, spiritual, or economic purposes. The fish consumption indicator is supported by the contaminants in edible fish sub-indicator, which uses data from contaminants in the fillets of Great Lakes fish collected by state, provincial, and US federal agencies. And the status is fair for most lakes except Lake Huron, which is assessed as good. Over the past 10 years that data were used for this assessment, concentrations of PCBs, which are a group of harmful human-made chemicals, have declined in fish fillets for most of the lakes, while remaining stable in Lake Superior. And over the same period, mercury levels have remained stable or decreased slightly. And over the longer term, PCB concentrations in fish fillets have declined substantially since the late 1970s when PCBs were banned. However, the rate of decline has slowed and concentrations are still above advisory benchmarks. The overall assessment for the fish consumption indicator is fair and improving. Our next indicator, toxic chemicals, is used to answer the question, have levels of toxic chemicals declined in the Great Lakes? In general, the answer is yes. Many chemicals such as PCBs and mercury have declined significantly in the Great Lakes in recent decades, but concentrations of some toxic chemicals still pose risks to human health and the environment. So overall, the toxic chemicals indicator is assessed as fair and the trend is unchanging to improving. And this indicator measures toxic chemicals in different components of the Great Lakes environment, including sediment, water, fish, herring gull eggs, and air. Data from federal and state long-term contaminant monitoring programs are used to support the assessment. An interesting fact that I'll share is the Environment Climate Change Canada herring gull egg contaminants dataset is the longest running continuous dataset for contaminants in wildlife in the world. Many chemicals such as PCBs and mercury have declined in the Great Lakes over the past 40 years, but concentrations of some toxic chemicals have stabilized at levels above guidelines. Okay, the next indicator is habitat and species, and we use the assessment data to answer the question, are the lakes supporting healthy wetlands and populations of native species? For this indicator, the answer is in some cases yes, and in others no. Healthy coastal wetlands exist in each Great Lake basin. However, Great Lakes coastal wetlands vary in quality depending on location, as we saw in the previous presentation. Stressors such as invasive species and climate change have resulted in negative impacts to the food web. However, native fish populations are responding well to restoration efforts. These sub-indicators assess coastal wetland flora and fauna, as well as the extent to which the Great Lakes tributaries remain accessible by migratory fish. The data come from the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Monitoring Program, the Marsh Monitoring Program, and the FishWorks database. Coastal wetlands in Lake Superior and the northern shores of Lake Michigan and Huron are generally in better condition than wetlands in Lakes Erie and Ontario. Overall, aquatic habitat connectivity is improving due to dam removals and other restoration projects. The Great Lakes aquatic food web is made up of many interacting species ranging from phytoplankton to prey fish and predator fish. Now, the 8 sub-indicators that I'm sharing here assess native species that belong to various parts of the Great Lakes food chain. Supporting data come from long-term federal, provincial, state, Great Lakes Fishery Commission, Nature Conservancy, and university datasets. The state of food web components is quite variable, and notable trends include continued declines in abundance of diparia, which is an aquatic invertebrate, in all Great Lakes but Superior, and improvements in both lake sturgeon and lake trout populations in most Great Lakes. Overall, the habitat species indicator is assessed as fair and unchanging. The next indicator is nutrients and algae and is used to answer the question, are nutrients in the Great Lakes at acceptable levels? For the most part, the answer is no. High nutrient levels in parts of Lake Erie and some embayments in other parts of the Great Lakes are contributing to persistent blooms of toxic cyanobacteria and nuisance algae Cladophora. At the same time, very low nutrient levels in the offshore waters of Lakes Michigan, Huron, and Ontario have resulted in decreased abundance of algae. So the overall assessment for this indicator is fair and unchanging, with data coming from federal and provincial long-term monitoring programs. It's important to note that algae is a natural and vital component of freshwater ecosystems, and phosphorus is a key nutrient for algal growth. However, too much phosphorus can result in harmful algal blooms and nuisance algae, and too little phosphorus can result in algal levels being too low to support a healthy food web. So it's a fine balance. As shown in this table, there are a mixture of status assessments for the sub-indicators, ranging from good to fair to poor. And it's easy to see that Lake Superior has good conditions across all of these sub-indicators, while Lake Erie has poor conditions for each. The trends are primarily unchanging and undetermined, except for Lake Erie's nearshore harmful algal bloom sub-indicator, which was assessed as improving, as satellite data show that algal bloom spatial extent significantly decreased over the 2012 to 2020 time period. So moving next to the invasive species indicator, we ask, are we limiting new introductions and impacts of non-native species to the Great Lakes? The answer to the are we limiting new introductions component is yes, but the answer to are we limiting the impacts of existing invasive species is no. Since the 1830s, over 180 non-native species have entered and established populations in the Great Lakes, but the rate of introduction of new non-native species has drastically declined over the last 20 years. However, the issue is that already established species can spread and cause further negative impacts throughout the basin. Now, this table here shows the two sub-indicators that were used to assess the invasive species indicator. The rate of new establishment of non-native species in the Great Lakes are considered good due to the fact that 4 new species were introduced in the most recent decade of data available, and this is significantly lower than previous recent decades. In fact, between 1961 and 2000, 15 to 20 new non-native species established populations in the Great Lakes per decade, compared to 4, as I mentioned. And this decline or improvement is largely due to the implementation of regulations on ballast water from transoceanic ships. However, once these species establish in the Great Lakes, many of them spread to other parts of the basin. Therefore, the impacts component is assessed as poor. The invasive species indicator also has some contextual sub-indicators that provide important information, but are not included in the actual overall assessment for this indicator. And this is because in most cases, they are already accounted for in the previous 2 sub-indicators that I shared on the last slide. And in the case of terrestrial invasive species, the assessment was undetermined as the assessment methodology is being updated. Now, some key takeaway messages from these contextual sub-indicator reports are that for sea lamprey populations have been reduced by 90% through ongoing basin-wide control efforts. However, Lake Superior populations of sea lamprey are still well above target levels. Focusing on the Dressen mussels sub-indicator, also known more commonly as zebra and quagga mussels, populations are low in Lake Superior, and population densities in Lake Erie have declined over the past 10 to 15 years. In Lakes Michigan, Huron, and Ontario, Dressen and mussel density and biomass continues to increase at deeper depths of the lakes. So up next is the groundwater indicator. More than 4,000 cubic kilometers of groundwater are stored in the Great Lakes Basin, and this is a volume that is approximately equal to that of Lake Michigan. So with this indicator, we ask, is groundwater negatively affecting the water quality of the Great Lakes? The answer is generally no, it's not. Groundwater discharge to streams generally provide good quality water that also promotes habitat for aquatic species. In some areas, however, groundwater has elevated levels of pollutants. Now, the groundwater indicator is supported by one sub-indicator, and that is groundwater quality. And the data comes from the Ontario Provincial Groundwater Monitoring Network and the US Geological Survey. This sub-indicator analyzes regional scale concentrations of two contaminants, nitrate, typically from fertilizers applied on agricultural fields, and chloride, typically from road salt. Groundwater is assessed as good in all lake basins except the Lake Ontario Basin, which is experiencing elevated chloride levels in many monitored wells. The trends for each lake basin are undetermined as more years of data are needed before a 10-year trend can be assessed. So next we'll move on to the watershed impacts and climate trends indicator to answer the question, are land use changes, climate change, or other stressors impacting the lakes? The answer is a most definite yes. The combined effect of 35 million people living in the Great Lakes watershed puts tremendous stress on the health of the Great Lakes. Stressors such as habitat loss and climate change have negatively impacted Great Lakes water quality and ecosystem health. Now, this table shows the watershed impacts sub-indicators, and overall, the status of watershed impacts is assessed as fair, and the trend is unchanging. Assessments of these sub-indicators follow a north to south gradient, where with the Lake Superior watershed being the least impacted, and the watersheds of Lakes Erie and Ontario, where 60% of the Great Lakes population resides, are the most impacted. And continued population growth is anticipated, with the most rapid growth currently occurring in the Greater Toronto area of the Lake Ontario Basin. Now, this table shows the climate trends sub-indicators, and note that these sub-indicators aren't assessed as status assessment because status thresholds have not been established, so only trends are determined here. And over the past few decades, we have seen increases in the amount of precipitation and water temperature, while ice cover has been decreasing overall. It's anticipated that climate change will continue to contribute to larger fluctuations and relatively rapid changes in Great Lakes water levels in the future. While precipitation has increased slightly, the amount of rain in individual storm events has greatly increased and can even be followed by periods of low rain or drought. Each of these climate-driven changes impacts the Great Lakes ecosystem. So shown here is just a recap of the 9 indicator assessments at the overall Great Lakes scale. So the indicators assessed as good are drinking water, beaches, invasive species prevention, and groundwater quality. The indicators assessed as fair are fish consumption, toxic chemicals, habitat and species, nutrients and algae, and watershed impacts. Invasive species impacts is assessed as poor, and climate trends themselves are reported but not assigned an assessment. Now, this slide here depicts how the indicator assessments vary by lake, and the colored icons below each lake represent the indicator categories, and the red, yellow, or green indicates the indicator assessment for that lake. The lake assessments are based on an average of the indicator assessments. So, for example, Lake Erie's overall assessment is poor. However, that does not mean that every indicator in the lake is poor. And this slide depicts the overall assessment that I shared in the last slide, but just in a different manner, where the entire Great Lakes Basin is shown. So as noted in the last slide, the overall status assessments for Lake Superior and Huron are good, Lake Michigan and Ontario are fair, and Lake Erie is poor. And I'll also note here that the overall assessment for the entire Great Lakes Basin is fair and unchanging. And this is based on a tally of all the indicators. So I'll just close with saying, just as important as establishing the assessments is reporting them out and delivering the messages out to the public. And this is done through various methods. The results of the assessments are presented at the Great Lakes Public Forum, which is a public meeting hosted by the governments of Canada and the United States every 3 years, typically following the publishing of the State of the Great Lakes reporting. This forum, among other purposes, provides an opportunity for the government to present on the results and field any questions from the public. Also, I'll note that Environment Climate Change Canada actively shares key facts and information from the State of the Great Lakes report through social media, namely through our Great Lakes Canada Twitter or X account. And I have an image there of an example tweet that's a tweet that has State of the Great Lakes information included in it. And finally, I'll note that Environment and Climate Change Canada actively work to share information through various meetings or conference opportunities. Some examples include the Lake-wide Action Management Plan Let's Talk webinar series, as well as participation at the 2023 Great Lakes Beach Association annual meeting. And I'll note that we're definitely willing and eager to present State of the Great Lakes information at other venues, and we encourage any members of the audience to reach out if there's any opportunities that are appropriate. At this point, I'd just like to end with saying thank you for tuning into my presentation. It's been an honor to share this important information with all of you, and I encourage you to check out the microsite for the State of the Great Lakes report, which I have a QR code for up on this slide. And my email is there as well if anyone would like to contact me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Jacob, for sharing all that work that goes into the State of the Great Lakes. Definitely a lot of information to unpack. Up next to talk about integration and the lake-wide action and management plans is Gurpreet Mangat. Gurpreet is an environmental scientist at Environment and Climate Change Canada, where she has held diverse roles over the past 6 years. Her current role is to develop lake-wide action and management plans under Annex 2 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement through collaborating with multi-jurisdictional teams and partners from both Canada and the United States. Gurpreet holds a master's in environmental science from the University of Toronto, and in her free time, she enjoys hiking and camping. Take it away, Gurpreet.
Perfect. Thanks, Cameron. I'll just bring up my presentation now. Okay. All right, how does that look?
Looks good.
Okay. Actually, I have this bar in the way that I want to try and remove. Just give me 1 second here. All right, so hi everyone, my name is Gurpreet Mangat and I'm with Environment Climate Change Canada. And as mentioned, today I'll be giving you a quick overview of all things lake-wide management. In particular, we'll look at how lake-wide management serves as what I like to call the ultimate integrator of the many individual initiatives and programs that run across the Great Lakes, some of which have been mentioned here today in our presentation so far. So with that, let's dive right in. So like most of our topics today, it all begins with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which as we know is a binational agreement that commits both Canada and the US to restoring and protecting the waters of the Great Lakes. And lake-wide management is one of the ways through which the parties, that's Canada and the US, aim to achieve that commitment. The agreement includes 10 annexes, and these are listed here on the slide. And these are really basically chapters that help guide the efforts that are needed to meet those agreement commitments. And through Annex 2, which is lake-wide management, the parties implement a lake-by-lake approach to achieve the purpose of this particular annex, which is to contribute to the achievement of various agreement objectives by assessing lake status and by addressing environmental stressors on a lake-wide scale using an ecosystem-based approach. In other words, the agreement recognizes that each Great Lake has its unique ecological characteristics and stressors and threats, and that these unique traits should therefore be factored into the management decisions for each individual lake. And that's kind of what we try and do here with lake-wide management. So what exactly do I mean when I say lake-wide management? What exactly is lake-wide management? Well, it's an open, ongoing process, which is overseen by Annex 2 co-chairs that helps us to determine for each lake how the lake is doing, what might be stressing the lake, and what actions, if any, can we take to address those stressors and threats. Lake-wide management also serves as a mechanism that helps to coordinate actions on the ground. It helps us to track progress and challenges along the way, and set priorities for science and monitoring to fill any data gaps. All right, while lake-wide management is a process, as we just saw, the lake partnerships for each lake are the people. So this term partnership is an umbrella term that refers to all the various agencies and community groups that are involved in implementing lake-wide management. These partnerships, they consist of a working group for each lake that's co-led by Environment Climate Change Canada and the US Environmental Protection Agency. And each of these working groups per lake consists of approximately 30 or so members. And these members represent federal, state, provincial, and municipal governments, as well as tribal governments, First Nations, Métis, and various watershed agencies. So in essence, lake-wide management helps create these diverse groups by bringing together the many different facets of lake monitoring, lake protection, and lake restoration that may otherwise be working in silos. And by doing so, enables that teamwork and collaboration, which is really a key element to the success of lake management as a whole. All right, so we have our commitments under the Water Quality Agreement, which is to restore and protect the Great Lakes. We have the process, which is lake-wide management, and we have the people, which are the partnerships. And all these elements sort of all join and come together into one document called the Lake-Wide Action and Management Plan, or LAMP for short, which captures the results of the lake-wide management process as a whole. So LAMPs are essentially science-driven plans that lake partnerships are using to report on the state of the ecosystem. So this is where we're answering those questions we saw earlier about how is the lake doing, what might be stressing the lake. And they're also used to capture the science and management priorities that are needed to fill any data gaps. And these LAMPs list out various actions from member agencies and the public at large to address those threats. So essentially, you can look at them as your one-stop shop on what's happening on the lakes. A LAMP is prepared for each lake on a 5-year cycle. And after the end of those 5 years, the status of each lake is reevaluated using the latest science. And as a result, all the actions also get updated accordingly. So how exactly are we presenting the science in these LAMPs that would lead us to taking action accordingly? Well, first, let's take a look at what we deem as being a healthy ecosystem. So what exactly are we working toward? And that's been provided to us by the Water Quality Agreement as the 9 general objectives of ecosystem health. And these were just presented right before me by Jacob in great detail, so I won't get into those details again. But if you recall from the top of the presentation, the purpose of Annex 2, lake-wide management, is to achieve these objectives, which then essentially sets the foundation of how we assess and measure lake health to inform our management decisions. So as described by Jacob, the SOGL, or the State of the Great Lakes process, assesses these objectives as good, fair, poor, or undetermined. And then within the LAMPs, these assessments are further augmented and fortified by additional research and programs brought forth by our partnership networks. And that's what I'm trying to convey here through this slide. It's that process of assembling and synthesizing results from the many existing programs that eventually end up feeding into these assessments within the LAMPs. So the actual assessments for each lake are centered around 5 main threats, which are impacts from chemical contaminant pollution, nutrient and bacterial pollution, threats to habitat and species, impacts from invasive species, and then any additional new or emerging threats that may not be captured in the previous 4 categories. And this can include things like microplastics, for example. And this slide demonstrates why I called LAMPs the ultimate integrators in the beginning. And that's because they use, support, and build on existing efforts happening across the Great Lakes for each lake. And these range from local all the way up to binational scales for these assessments. And then we have member agencies on our partnerships who would identify actions that align with their respective program mandates in order to help address these threats within each lake. The information that's being pulled into the LAMPs can come from sources like the nearshore assessment that Mary presented earlier. Results from the baseline habitat survey also feed into this that Anders presented earlier. Climate change impacts are discussed with each of these threats individually as well, and many others, including the provincial fish contaminant monitoring programs that look at levels of contaminants within edible fish to inform their consumption advisories, areas of concern remedial action plans that address localized environmental legacy impairments, We also look at academic research and findings. And then there's the coastal wetland monitoring programs that tell us how habitats and species are doing. And then there's binational strategies that help us address chemicals of mutual concern, for instance. And the list goes on. So there's many initiatives that we try and capture in the LAMPs. And this slide is just a small snippet of that. So one initiative that's listed here that I want to make special mention of is the Cooperative Science and Monitoring Initiative, or CSMI, which is actually an initiative under Annex 10 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that provides science and monitoring information which may not be otherwise addressed through routine agency programs that are involved in the partnerships. So science and monitoring is actually always occurring on the Great Lakes, independent of CSMI and beyond CSMI. But this initiative is closely linked to lake-wide management in that CSMI's activities are conducted in response to priorities that are established by the lake partnerships on each lake. And what that means is that Annex 2, which is the science annex under the Water Quality Agreement, priorities are shared with Annex 2 is a lake-wide management annex. Their science and monitoring priorities are shared with Annex 10, which is the science annex, to be done through CSMI that would then supplement those ongoing initiatives under lake-wide management to address any data gaps that we're not able to fill. And lake-wide management runs on a 5-year cycle, so does CSMI. And that cycle is presented here on the slide. And each lake would fall somewhere on this cycle every year, which begins with priority setting. And this is where lake-wide management feeds in, followed by planning, field work, analysis, and then reporting out. All right, so bringing it all together, this slide looks very busy, but my intention behind this slide is to basically show you how all the various elements that I've been talking about so far are weaved together and presented in the LAMPs. So up at the top, we have the 9 Great Lakes water quality objectives that we're trying to achieve. And then each objective is influenced by one of the 5 threats, which are assessed through the many lake-wide programs and initiatives at the local, regional, federal, and or by national level. And then last but not least, we have the management actions, and this is where the rubber meets the road essentially. So lake partnerships identify these actions that are informed by and could be complementary to other management efforts that are active within these ecosystems. Okay, so that was the context, the process, and I hope I haven't lost any of you yet. But if you're still with me, I'd like to go through some quick examples that might help demonstrate the whole process in action. So let's start with the first example here that addresses the threat posed by invasive sea lamprey. So the LAMP would identify implementation of control measures as the management action. And then our partners on our partnerships, which would involve, which would be DFO, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, U.S. Geological Survey, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, would be the ones that would be named next to this commitment, since their programs are mandated to manage invasive species. And then they would roll out specific projects like conducting lamprey treatments and installing lamprey barriers on the Great Lakes as those control measures. And in this case, these efforts have led to a 90% reduction of sea lamprey on the Great Lakes, as Jacob mentioned earlier. And this project here is an example from Lake Huron specifically. And then we have another example that deals with the threat of chemical contamination by remediating contaminated sediment on Lake Ontario. So agencies listed for this commitment are Environment Climate Change Canada and the province, where they work with the local community to implement this multi-year project that's delivered in several phases and would end up managing over 600,000 cubic meters of contaminated sediment at Randall Reef in Hamilton Harbor once it's all completed. And then last but not least, we have the habitat loss threat that's being addressed by Environment Climate Change Canada, the province, and a local conservation authority up in Thunder Bay, where all partners are working together to implement a habitat strategy on Lake Superior that would end up restoring aquatic and riparian habitat and improving access to important fish spawning areas in that region. So that's how the LAMP lays it all out, with committing agencies to specific actions to deal with all those threats. We do have an internal process in place that helps us to track these projects as they're implemented. And that's done through member agencies providing updates during lake partnership calls, which we hold on a monthly basis for each lake, and through a formal implementation tracking process that occurs twice. So once midway through the 5-year cycle of the LAMP, and then once again at the end, where agencies provide an update on their projects and commitments. We also report out to the public through various means, including releasing what we call annual reports that give quick updates on all projects that are underway or completed within a year. So the examples that I just presented would be similar to what you would see in those annual reports. And we reach out to the public through holding webinars and meetings as well. We have a Let's Talk series where experts come and share research findings on specific LAMP topics. All right, so if there's one thing that I would really like to emphasize from today's presentation, it's that the lake-wide management process is a collaborative one. And that means that everyone, including all of you on the call today, plays a vital role in that process. If you aren't already involved, you can always get involved and strengthen lake-wide management in many different ways, including providing review and feedback on our LAMPs once they're being developed and when they go out for public comment, reading annual reports. So these documents can be easily accessed at binational.net. And you can dive into any specific details about any particular topics for any one lake or all the lakes if you're interested. You can also participate in Great Lake events captured on our Great Lakes calendar and attend the public meetings and webinars. So our Let's Talk webinar series that I mentioned are quite well attended, and we actually just planned all the upcoming series for this year, where we have some exciting talks lined up for each lake. The dates are on the slide here, the tentative dates and topics, but I believe we'll be sharing these slides after this webinar, so you don't have to feel rushed to write them down. And also, I think emails are sent out well in advance for these webinars to register as well. And you can access online data portals to stay involved and to stay updated on the latest science. And last but not least, you can get involved in the actual projects themselves that your local communities may be implementing on the ground. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. If there's anything any of you would like to get in touch about or learn more about regarding lake-wide management, please don't hesitate to reach out. My details are on the slide. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Gurpreet, for that context on lake-wide management. Our final presenter of the webinar to tie everything together and present some of the key takeaways will be Nancy Stadler-Salt from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Nancy is a Great Lakes coordinator at Environment and Climate Change Canada. One of her main areas of work is leading the State of the Great Lakes Reporting, a binational initiative to report on Great Lakes ecosystem conditions using a suite of science-based indicators. Through this work, Nancy has been fortunate to meet and work with many amazing people passionate about the Great Lakes. Nancy has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Guelph and a Certificate of Meteorology from York University, and started her career with Environment Canada as a meteorologist. With that, here's Nancy.
Great, thanks, Cameron. I'm just going to pull the presentation up. So, can you see that?
Yep, we can.
Okay, awesome. All right. So I'm Nancy Stadler-Salt with Environment and Climate Change Canada. and I'll be presenting this wrap up. But however, Rick Wilson of Conservation Ontario also supported the development of this presentation. So I'm trying to capture some of Rick's ideas in here too. So I jumped ahead, but I wanted to also say we did hear a lot of great information on various assessment initiatives this morning, focused mostly on the Canadian side of the border, but with some binational initiatives included as well, the State of the Great Lakes and the LAMP or Lake-Wide Action and Management Plans. I'm going to try and connect some of the dots between these assessment initiatives. So before we get to that first, just wanted to talk briefly about why we assess. So we assess to report on conditions of complex ecosystems, and we often use indicators or metrics to tell us something about the ecosystem. It doesn't tell you everything about that system, but it can indicate if things are changing. And then that allows us to do further exploration to see why the change is happening. We also assess so we can communicate information on these complex ecosystems in an understandable way. And we assess so we have a snapshot of current conditions so we can compare that to in the future to those conditions, and then we can over time develop trends or identify what has changed, and that allows us to predict future conditions. We also assess to inform our decisions being made about restoration and protection projects. And we assess to measure progress towards our objectives and to know if our restoration actions have been effective. And on top of that, we use sound science to base our assessments on. So the best science that is currently available from generally long-term monitoring programs. So the assessment initiatives shown today cover different scales and geographies within the Great Lakes Basin. They complement each other and there isn't a lot of overlap. So starting in the terrestrial component of the Great Lakes watershed, we heard about the watershed and tributary health assessments through the Conservation Authority watershed report cards. Then going to the shorelines, we heard about the baseline coastal assessment survey for the terrestrial component and the nearshore assessment for the aquatic component of the shorelines. And then finally moving to the open waters of the Great Lakes, we have the State of the Great Lakes, which looks at an overview of conditions and trends in the Great Lakes themselves, while lake-wide reporting takes the State of the Great Lakes assessment and adds more lake-specific information to that. So this table, I don't expect you to read everything in this table, but it's a summary of the assessment initiatives that we heard about today. I'm going to cover most of this information in the slides that follow. But one thing to note about the assessment initiatives that we heard about is that most are updated every 5 years. The exceptions are the baseline habitat survey, the update frequency hasn't been determined yet, and State of the Great Lakes, which, as you heard, has an update frequency of every 3 years. So this graphic or map is showing a composite of the assessment areas that we heard about earlier. So starting in the Great Lakes themselves, the gray-blue areas, we have the State of the Great Lakes reporting, which is focused mainly on the open waters, but does also consider some nearshore, coastal wetland, and watershed measures. As well, the lake-wide action and management plans take the State of the Great Lakes assessments for each individual Great Lake and then adds more lake-specific information to the assessment and considers management actions to restore and protect water quality. The brighter blue areas on the Canadian side is the nearshore zone. These are the receiving waters for all of the tributaries that drain into the Great Lakes, and this zone is impacted by most of the activities that happen in the Great Lakes watershed. It's also the zone where most people interact with the Great Lakes, where we swim and fish, and where we get our drinking water from. Moving up onto the land, right along the Canadian shorelines of the Great Lakes is where the baseline habitat survey took place over a 2 kilometer wide swath along the shoreline. It doesn't show up all that well at the scale of this map, but it's that darker blue-green line along the Canadian shoreline. And then moving inland, the darker green areas are the 36 Conservation Authority areas. These are contributing tributary watersheds to the Great Lakes, and what happens in the watershed generally has an impact on Great Lakes water quality. So each of the assessment initiatives that we heard about today uses a different way to assess. We heard about the letter grades that the conservation authorities use to assess their watersheds. A and B grades are excellent and good respectively. C and D are fair and poor, and F is very poor. The nearshore assessment looks at 12 measures and then determines a cumulative stress category for each of the regional units along the Canadian shoreline. The stress rankings are very low, low, moderate, and high. The baseline habitat survey has established the area of various habitat types in the 2 kilometer zone around the Canadian Great Lakes shoreline. Although no assessment has been made at this time, with future repeated surveys, we'll be able to tell if we are gaining or losing habitat in this critical zone when it's compared with this baseline data. And it's not just about spatial area of habitat, as we heard. That is one measure, but also considers biodiversity, ecological condition, ecological function, protected lands, and restored habitats. State of the Great Lakes uses status assessments of good, fair, or poor, and trend assessments of improving, unchanging, and deteriorating for about 40 sub-indicators to determine an assessment of each Great Lake, as well as an overall assessment for the Great Lakes as a whole. The lake-wide program takes the state of the Great Lakes information and regroups it into 5 categories and adds additional lake-specific information. So the next few slides are showing the most recent assessments. So for this slide, we're seeing the most recent assessment of the watersheds within the conservation authorities. And it's focusing in specific on surface water quality, which includes water chemistry parameters such as phosphorus, as well as benthic macroinvertebrates and E. coli. This is one category out of 3 that is assessed. Forest conditions and groundwater quality are 2 other categories that are also assessed but not shown here. For water quality, all watersheds assessed as excellent and good water quality, or grades A and B, can be seen in green. Watersheds with fair or poor assessments, grades C and D, can be seen in yellow, and those assessed as very poor, or grade F, can be seen in red. You can see that there are small splotches, or I hope you can see that there are small splotches of red in Western Lake Erie, Western Lake Ontario, and Eastern Ontario. This map is showing the most recent assessment of the Canadian nearshore waters. Regional units, or areas with very low stress, are shown in green. Those with low stress can be seen in yellow, while moderately stressed regional nearshore units can be seen in orange, and high stress regional units are red. The stress assessments are based on 12 measures grouped into 4 categories: coastal processes, contaminants in water and sediment, nuisance and harmful algae, and human use. And this map is showing the most recent assessment for each Great Lake using the state of the Great Lakes indicators and sub-indicators. The assessments are based on 9 indicators and 40 supporting sub-indicators, covering a broad spectrum of ecosystem issues and components, including nutrients and algae, toxic chemicals, habitat and species, invasive species, groundwater, watershed impacts, and climate trends. In addition, State of the Great Lakes considers some components of the ecosystem that can have an impact on human health, including drinking water, beaches, and fish consumption. Considering all of this information together, the following assessments were determined for 2022. Lakes Superior and Huron were assessed as good, Lakes Michigan and Ontario were assessed as fair, and Lake Erie was assessed as poor. And just a reminder that these are big lakes with complex ecosystems, and just because a lake is assessed as good overall, it doesn't mean that everything in the lake is considered good. There may be some components assessed as fair or even poor, and there may be local conditions that are not good. Similarly, just because a lake is assessed as poor, it doesn't mean that everything in the lake is poor. There may be some components assessed as fair or even good, and there may be local conditions that are not poor. So looking at the assessments from the initiatives that we heard about, we can see that a couple of areas have higher stress and poorer condition assessments. First, along the north shore of Western Lake Erie, where agriculture in the watershed is a stress to the surface waters that drain into Lake Erie, and this leads to nutrient and algal problems in the lake. The second area is the Golden Horseshoe around Western Lake Ontario, where a high urban population and development have placed a lot of stress on the waters of Western Lake Ontario. There are also areas that are in relatively good shape, such as the North Shore and southeastern shore of Lake Superior, and the Bruce Peninsula region and the south shore of Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron. These areas have less stress due to lower populations, less development in agriculture, and a higher proportion of natural habitat and biodiversity. Turning now to look at the indicators or measures themselves, we didn't find any indicators or metrics used in every one of these assessments. There were some that were used in most of the assessment initiatives, and these include nutrients or algae indicators such as phosphorus or harmful algal blooms, indicators of the benthic community, indicators for E. coli, indicators for land cover, including forest cover or wetlands, and indicators for shoreline hardening and tributary connectivity. These indicators aren't necessarily exactly the same between the different assessment programs. However, they are indicators of indications of common ways to measure the ecosystem and various stressors. So this graphic is showing the common indicators for each assessment initiative. I've grouped the State of the Great Lakes and Lakewide together since Lakewide builds upon State of the Great Lakes. Using that as a starting point, I'm showing the connections to the other reporting initiatives through these common indicators that can be seen on the right side. And then there are other connections as well between each of the reporting initiatives. So in each of the assessments, there are stressors that have an impact on the ecosystem being assessed. These common stressors include urban development, agriculture, nutrient and chemical pollution, climate change, and invasive species. These stressors are common because they are impacting the whole Great Lakes Basin to varying degrees right across the basin. And on this slide, I wanted to focus on some of the challenges that are faced by every assessment initiative. Some of these are encountered by the assessment initiatives that we heard about, and they include spatial coverage, temporal coverage, resources, and how to utilize other sources of knowledge. So starting with spatial coverage, depending on the metric, data coverage can be sparse, especially in northern areas of the Great Lakes Basin. While remote sensing helps with this issue, not all metrics can be monitored in this way. Then with temporal coverage, sometimes there can be a break in a time series of data due to various reasons, such as the recent COVID pandemic, which stopped monitoring programs and laboratory analyses for safety reasons for a year or more. Other time series breaks can be caused by a change in monitoring protocols or even a ship being out for an extended period of time for maintenance. Moving to resources, in order to assess and report, monitoring needs to happen. And in order to monitor, there needs to be resources allocated to it. Resources can be a limiting factor on what to monitor and how broadly to monitor. For example, monitoring programs may have an expanding list of monitoring priorities or an expanding requirement to monitor in other areas, yet the resources may not change. So setting priorities is helpful in this situation. And also efficiencies with how the monitoring is done and collaboration with partners are also often considered. And then incorporating other sources of knowledge, such as citizen science and traditional ecological knowledge, can be challenging as it may not be collected in the same way. So, however, figuring out this challenge where appropriate will make the assessments more robust and inclusive in the long run. Each assessment has its own caveats or footnotes, and it's good that we are aware of them. So here are a few high-level common caveats. Starting with the accuracy of the assessment depends on the quality of data and information used in the assessment. Better quality data used in the right way will lead to better assessment. And as we just spoke about, it's important to be aware of the data gaps. In the Great Lakes region, we have seen that there's less data in northern parts of the Great Lakes Basin and also in some of the tributary watersheds. And lastly, assessments themselves can mask local conditions. At the scale of the State of the Great Lakes assessments, we are averaging condition assessments at from various sites across a whole lake, and sometimes averaging the averages. Localized conditions can vary from the overall broader assessment. So I want to end things with the things that the assessment initiatives that were presented today have in common, along with some of the strengths of these assessment efforts. First, there are partners, and as we heard, there are many partners. And we need partners because no one jurisdiction has the mandate to monitor and report on all of the necessary ecosystem components at the whole geographic scale of interest. And it seems that as the scale of the program gets larger, the more partners are needed to do a comprehensive assessment. In fact, the State of the Great Lakes reporting process has over 40 agency and organization partners at the federal, provincial, and state, and regional or local level, as well as non-government organizations, academia, and Indigenous partners. Next are the data sources. So like the partners, there are usually many sources of data that are required to make a robust and scientifically sound assessment. Again, the larger the scale and scope of the assessment typically requires more data sources to be considered. Often these data come from long-term monitoring programs. Again, using State of the Great Lakes assessment as an example, there are approximately 100 data sets that were utilized to assess ecosystem conditions. Once we know what information we need to make our assessments, we need to synthesize complex data into more understandable, digestible information. This is a key role of the assessment initiatives, and all of the examples presented today do this. We can't present reams and reams of data to our audiences and expect them to interpret it. We, with our science partners, need to find the key pieces of information and clearly present that and make the linkages in the findings. But we also should allow others to be able to dig into the data if they so desire. And that's the open and transparent component. Some of the data used in the assessment initiatives that we heard about is accessible on open data web pages. And we're working to make more of it available. Communication and reporting is a very important component of the assessment process. There is little value of doing an assessment if we aren't sharing it with decision makers and the public. The Conservation Ontario story map is a great example of a clear and visual way to show and explain the assessment and its components. And as well as the reports that we all produce, there's often social media posts highlighting key messages from the reports. All right, so I have a few slides where we have QR codes that you can scan to go directly to a report or a web page. First slide is focused on the watershed report cards, the Conservation Ontario story map, and the watershed checkup. This QR code will take you directly to the baseline coastal habitat survey for Lake Erie. These QR codes will take you to the nearshore assessment and the methodology report. These QR codes will take you to the lake-wide action and management plans, as well as a QR code for the calendar of future Let's Talk webinars. These QR codes will take you to the State of the Great Lakes webpage, as well as directly to the State of the Great Lakes 2022 report in a user-friendly web layout that we tend to call the microsite. And lastly, this QR code will take you to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that we heard referenced several times in the webinar today. And so I just want to thank you for your time and attention. And in parting, I'd like to say that assessments are a very important part of knowing whether our restoration and protection efforts are being effective. The Great Lakes are a global treasure that we need to preserve for now and future generations. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Nancy, for tying that neat bow around all the great presentations that we saw this morning. At this time, we're going to ask all of our panelists to turn their cameras back on for the Q&A portion. But remember to stay muted until answering a question. And of course, please remember to unmute yourself before you speak. Just a quick reminder, we saw it pop up in the chat a few times. The webinar recording and the presentations will be posted on latornell.ca in approximately 1 week's time, and an email will be sent to all the webinar registrants once the recording is available. So keep an eye out in your emails for that. To lead us into our panel discussion, I'm going to pass it back over to Rick Wilson from Conservation Ontario, who will be moderating the discussion portion of this webinar. So take it away, Rick.
Thanks, Cameron, and thanks again to all the panelists for the great presentations that we've seen today. And I'm going to encourage people to continue to add questions into the Q&A as we go along here. If you haven't already submitted one, please do so now. I'm going to start with the ones that were the most highly upvoted. And then if we get through them all, I'll go through some of the questions that have already been answered by the panelists in the Q&A as well. So keep an eye on that if you had a question that we don't get to here. The top voted question is for Nancy. The slide showing the map, and I'm assuming that's the map with all of the assessments on it, indicates more monitoring on the Canadian side than the US side. Are there other efforts to monitor and grade on the US side than indicated in the map?
Thanks for that question. The focus of today's webinar was on monitoring and assessment programs on the Canadian side. As I mentioned, there are two initiatives that are binational initiatives, the Lake-wide Action and Monitoring Plans. That is a binational initiative, as well as State of the Great Lakes reporting. So we do get data for those initiatives from both sides of the border. Just wasn't presented in today's presentation, but there is lots of monitoring on the US side.
Okay, great, thanks. We have a question here for Jacob. Why is water level increasing only in Lake Erie?
Great, thanks very much for that question. So for the water levels sub-indicator, the trend information that I shared was for the long-term trend, and I'd have to dig into the sub-indicator report in a bit more detail to identify if there's any specific information that would answer that question. But what I can add, I looked through it through briefly. To re-familiarize myself with it. And again, it's based on long-term trends, but I mean, of note, one piece of information that's included in the report is that in 2019, the average lake level for June for Lake Erie was the highest lake level ever recorded on Lake Erie for any month, while in 2020, the 4 months between February and May set individual monthly records. So of course that's, that was the case for all the Great Lakes having higher water levels during that time. But I mean, that's one piece of information for more recent water level related information that I can share. But I would have to dig a little bit further and see if that information is included in the sub-indicator reports. And Nancy, as anything off the top of your head that you can think of that would give a more satisfactory answer?
I think the big piece that you touched on, Jacob, is that these are trends over a period of time, and the long-term trend is quite a length of time. So it may not be the same as the current conditions that are being experienced. And the other point to consider is that water levels, of course, are very much influenced by the inflow of water from that watershed. And so if we have a lot of weather systems, maybe crossing Lake Erie or the lower lakes region, they can impact the water levels significantly as well.
Okay, great. I have another one here for Jacob. Is it correct that contaminants such as PCBs and mercury are locked up in the sediment in the Great Lakes, and therefore disturbing the sediment is a bad idea, as it can impact local water quality when it occurs?
So, I mean, my understanding in general, yes, and that's another case where more information may be detailed in the sub-indicator report, and I'd have to dig into that to identify if that's covered in depth in the sub-indicator report. But in general, I believe the answer to that would be yes. But I'm not too sure off the top of my head if that is kind of included in the sub-indicator report in greater detail, and therefore it would be included in the State of the Great Lakes assessments overall. But again, generally, yes, is my understanding of the answer to that question. Again, Nancy, anything further to add to that?
Yeah, I think I don't have anything further, Jacob. The only thing that we were remiss on doing is providing a link to the technical report where people can go to get the detailed sub-indicator reports. At least I don't think we provided that link, so perhaps we can put that into the chat.
Sure, I can do that now. So just for everyone's knowledge, what I'm posting is kind of the landing page for the State of the Great Lakes reporting. So if you scroll to the bottom, there's 3 separate links, one for the State of the Great Lakes report, which is kind of the shorter main report, if you will. And then there's a link for the microsite, the more interactive microsite. And then the third link is for the technical report that contains all of the sub-indicator reports. So it's a very lengthy report, but I'll put it in the chat right now.
Thanks, Jacob. While you're doing that, I have another question for you.
Right.
Does Jacob's data on watershed health come from the CO watershed report cards, or has ECCC done its own assessment?
So for the and I assume this is related to the watershed impacts and climate trends, specifically watershed impacts component indicator, and it varies where the data comes from. So for example, for the human population sub-indicator, we rely on data on the Canadian side from Statistics Canada. Forest cover, for example, another sub-indicator, we rely on various data sets from Canada and the United States. And again, there's a lot of data sets, so there could be some overlap. I'm not overly familiar with what specifically is used in the Conservation Ontario watershed report cards. And for the land cover sub-indicator on the Canadian side, we rely on data from Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. And another one, for example, hardened shorelines. Anders would probably be better to answer that one because we rely. He is the Canadian author for that sub-indicator report, and as he mentioned in his briefly in his presentation, that's again that's a report that he authors and uses his data set that he presented on to provide the assessment. So, Anders, any insight for anything to add for that for the hardened shorelines?
No, the hardened shorelines was done in-house across using the latest ortho imagery and sort of checking with different layers. But no, we did it down to almost 100-meter intervals. So the resolution on that's pretty good. And we've actually started repeating that. Actually, I could turn that over to Mary because she actually just redid the Lake Erie version. So we actually have a bit of a change detection now on the next version. So maybe Mary, if you wanted to chime in a little more on anything you found in Lake Erie.
Yeah, so I recently did the Lake Erie assessment, and there's been some change detection. So we used Swoop 2020 imagery, and it was kind of cool to see on the on the eastern shore, closer to the Niagara River, you could literally see like bulldozers hardening the shoreline. So that was really cool. But yeah, there's been some more shoreline hardening and less naturalization.
Thanks. And for the non GIS people in the crowd, Swoop is the Southwestern Ontario Orthophoto Project, which is spearheaded by the province of Ontario. The next question is a general one, and we'll leave it open for whichever panelists want to cover it, but it's I'm wondering if there is a move toward creating methods for assessing climate change impacts for the Great Lakes to align better with the other indicators. Who wants to brave an answer to that question?
Sorry, Rick, can you repeat the question? I was
sure.
Looking for it.
Is there a move, or sorry, is there a move toward creating methods for assessing climate change impacts for the Great Lakes to align better with the other indicators?
So there is a move within State of the Great Lakes, and I believe the lake-wide program as well, to bring in more climate impact information into our reporting and tie it more closely to our indicators. At this time, we're just starting with that, so I can't give any examples, but we are just starting to explore that on how we better bring in climate impacts into our reporting. So hopefully in future you will see more of that in State of the Great Lakes lake-wide. Gurpreet, I'll leave that to you to talk about the Lake Erie report and climate impacts included in there.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there to say we've actually started to bring that climate change discussion with each of the threats that I was talking about. So earlier we would talk about climate change as like an additional threat, but we're trying to roll it up and weave it into the threat assessments as well, and look at how each individual threat might be influenced further by climate change impacts. So we're doing that with the next Lake Erie LAMP that will be hopefully published sometime this year. And we get the expertise from our climate change folks. So they come in and they provide us with all the science data and the analysis to say this is what's happening on the lake with respect to climate change with contaminant levels, for example. And they really help us to paint that picture better. But in general, I would say climate change doesn't really change, the impacts of climate change won't really change too much between lakes. Like it's a wide enough impact that it happens across lakes. And the assessment kind of focuses more on the Great Lakes level as opposed to lake specific impacts. But yes, we will be incorporating that in our next Lake Erie LAMP with our threat assessments, individual threat assessments.
Okay, great. Thank you. A question for Nancy. Any links to the existing Ontario source drinking water quality assessments and reporting by municipalities?
Within our drinking water, treated drinking water sub-indicator, we actually do talk about source water. And that information is presented by the province of Ontario. The Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks does author that sub-indicator. So there is a bit of source water information in one of our sub-indicator reports. And to get further information on that, you can go to that sub-indicator report, and Jacob posted the link to the technical report. And so if you go into that technical report, or if you go to the microsite, it's probably a faster way, and go to the drinking water indicator, you can get directly to that sub-indicator that way.
Okay, thank you. One that just jumped to the top is what % of the shoreline is in private versus public land? I mean, they mean ownership. Does anyone have any idea about how to answer that question?
I can take a quick stab, more of just a context perspective. I mean, a lot of the shoreline, especially when we've done the analysis between hardened and natural shoreline, a lot of that you can kind of almost see as you're going through and you see the hardened areas, you can see the development behind it. It's not, we haven't done an analysis of what percentage was hardened is owned by one or the other, but for the most part, you can understand that a lot of the hardened shoreline does represent either residential areas, residential groups on the shoreline, or development, or it's a channel, like a shipping channel. So a lot of it is owned. Where there's natural, it's a mix. There is a lot of people that are doing nature-based solutions or letting it go natural. So I would hazard to say a majority of the hardened shoreline would be private, privately owned, or publicly owned in the sense of that it's a municipality that owns it. But that's a fair assessment. Mary, would you like to provide any additional context there?
No, I think you covered it all.
Okay, thank you. So we had a question. Is there a report that combines US data with the Canadian GLP data? And then there was a follow-up. Let me be more specific. What is the comparability of the data used for the binational reporting example LAMPS or lake-wide programs between CA efforts described in detail here versus the US?
Okay, I can take a shot at answering that one. And if I understand correctly, I think the question might be asking what are sort of the parallel programs on the US side, perhaps. So the Lake-wide Management Action Plans, the LAMPs, they are binational. So the folks that are on those partnerships, they range from local municipalities all the way up to federal and state. So they include members from the US side as well. So when we go to write these reports, whatever discussions that we're having, I only mentioned today in today's presentation the Canadian networks that we feed in, or the Canadian networks that feed into our assessment, because of the focus of the webinar today is the Canadian side, but there are equivalent efforts on the US side that feed into those assessments as well. So for instance, if we're looking at beach health, we'd look at beach advisories from the Canadian local health units, and then we'd also look at the same from the state level health units to inform our assessment for that. So yeah, if you look closely into these lamps, you'll see that there is equivalent information presented for both Canada and the US. Yeah, I think that answers that, hopefully.
Okay, I think so. Thank you. There's a question here about, is there any monitoring of plastic and microplastics in the Great Lakes?
I can take a stab at that, Rick.
Thanks.
So there is monitoring of plastics and microplastics in the Great Lakes. However, there's not ongoing monitoring programs at this time set up for plastics or microplastics, but both the province, Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada, are looking at the plastics issue and doing research into the plastics issue. There are other groups that are also looking at plastics in the Great Lakes, not just in Canada, but in the US as well. So there's a lot of work and interest on plastics right now. And I believe that microplastics were nominated as a potential chemical of mutual concern under Annex 3 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So they'll be looking at plastics a little more closely in the future. There's a list of other contaminants that have been proposed as chemicals of mutual concern. They have to go through them one by one. I think plastics or microplastics were a fairly recent proposal or nomination. So it might be a little bit of time before they get to that. But yes, there is work. In short, there is work going on. There just isn't any kind of broad scale monitoring program by the federal or provincial government at this time.
Okay, great. Thank you. Along similar lines, there's a question for Jacob. Do the toxicology assessments include PFAS, and will they in the future? And what guidelines are there for toxicology?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so the in terms of the sub-indicator reports, the toxic chemicals in whole fish and atmosphere do include PFAS. But the other ones didn't include mention of it. And going forward, there is like for the next reporting cycle, there is a plan to, not a plan, what we're asking the authors for is to, where appropriate, share graphics or information regarding chemicals of mutual concern. But then the assessment does not necessarily have to be focused on chemicals of mutual concern. Nancy, did you want to add to that at all?
No, well, the only thing I shouldn't say no. The toxic chemicals sub-indicators that Jacob covered in his presentation monitor toxic chemicals in different media, and PFAS is not a concern and hopefully won't be a concern in all of them as of yet, just in the two that Jacob just mentioned. Guidelines for the toxicology, I'm not sure if the sub-indicator reports include that, but again, the link to the microsite and going to the toxic chemical sub-indicators would provide that information if they're included in there.
Okay, thank you. The next one's a great question. I mean, they're all great questions, but this one in particular. Are the results from these reports used to create legislation for improving the Great Lakes watershed? For example, reduction of shoreline construction on private land, etc. I'm not sure if the authors of these reports know how they get used, but is there anyone who has some particular experience that they can share?
I'll jump in here, Rick, and then others can add about their experience. It is challenging to know how these reports are used kind of once they're out of, once we've released them. However, we have asked the question of State of the Great Lakes reports, and we do have an example with respect to invasive species, aquatic invasive species in the Great Lakes. And it's not creating a piece of legislation, but just how the information was used to strengthen or trying to strengthen protocols in the Great Lakes to prevent further spread of invasive species. So we have the sub-indicator on rates of aquatic non-indigenous species in the Great Lakes basin, as well as into each individual lake basin. And one of our partners in Transport Canada was very interested in the information on the lake-to-lake spread of invasive species, and was using that information from the sub-indicator report to help tighten up ballast water releases between lakes, because that is one way that invasive species spread between lakes when the ships are going from one lake to another, and if they're if they're emptying their ballast, then they could potentially be spreading invasive species. So it's just an example of what we are, one example of what we're aware of how someone has used that information to help tighten up and protect Great Lakes from spread of invasive species.
That's great. Thank you. Another question here is, overall, have the CA report cards over the past years shown improvements with all this energy and resources that are going toward improving environmental attention and conditions? And maybe I'll pass that to Loveleen.
Yeah, thanks. This is something that the report cards have not attempted to do yet, is look at trends. It has been just 5-year increments of current conditions in 5-year increments. And so now that we've done 3 rounds, our goal in this next round for 2028 is, through the sub-working group on data analysis, is to talk about the trends and how can we look at changes over time. So stay tuned, and I hope we can answer that question for you in the next round.
Yeah, thanks, Loveleen. This is a long one. ACER, Association for Canadian Education Resources, a 35-year-old charity, has benchmarked planting site data in 14 Conservation Authority watersheds in Southern Ontario to share about 1,000 trees per CA beginning many years ago. Updating these long-term data needs, RE measurement, to determine the success of species choices per site made by CAs. Please recommend where support could be found to enable remeasurements and analysis. Not sure who that one's appropriate for.
I think that might be for me.
Okay.
I can take a stab at it if anybody else wants to add in. So nice to hear from you, Alice. Alice and I know each other. There's a couple of ways to think about this. We do have, speaking from the watershed report card perspective, we do track percent forest cover, percent streamside vegetation, and see how things are changing. The status of them is the amount improving over time. So that is one way to measure it, but I think what you're talking about is specific species. That's not something that the watershed report cards do specifically, but some CAs, individual CAs, do that work. So I would encourage you to potentially contact each one individually and to see if they do that. I do know, for example, Credit Valley Conservation has also pulled together, I believe it's a species list of climate vulnerable species. And I believe we've passed that along to our planning department and our restoration staff, so they know how to plant for the future as well. So there's work being done on this, but just not, I'm not sure at each individual CA level how it's being handled.
All right, thanks. Can anyone comment on how Indigenous communities have been involved in any of these initiatives?
I can jump in and I can get us started, and other folks can chime in as well. So for the lake-wide management action plans, LAMPs, those partnerships that we have that are binational, they also have memberships from the various Indigenous communities from those particular lake basins. So First Nations and the Métis Nation of Ontario sit in on those partnerships, and they attend those monthly calls and feed into the discussion that happens for all things lake-wide management. And then beyond that, we also offer meetings with First Nation, sort of nation to nation, one-on-one type meetings where we provide that additional opportunity for them to feed into the LAMPs as well. So there's the opportunity to feed into the development of LAMPs once it goes out for comment within the working groups that they're members of. And then there's that additional opportunity to weigh in one-on-one as well, that we offer to hold meetings in person or virtual, or even through email communications. And then beyond that, all the agency partners that are at the table, they might have their individual relationships with Indigenous communities to help roll out their programs. So for example, the areas of concern program that feeds into the lake-wide management process, they would have various funding agreements with local communities to help implement some habitat improvement projects, for example. So there's many ways through which Indigenous communities are involved, and we make sure that the Indigenous knowledge, particularly the TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, is integrated into these LAMPs, as that's a significant part of lake-wide management.
That's great, thank you. One for Loveleen. Would you confirm if wetlands had been more of a focus in previous watershed report cards, and clarify why new report cards do not always report out on wetland condition, coastal and inland wetlands? Is this an accurate observation? If not, set me straight.
So wetlands have not been a part of the formal report card process in the last 15 years, so the last 3 rounds that I'm aware of. It is an issue. If my other co-chair was here right now, he is very passionate about wetlands and wants to include it as another indicator. So I'm sure he would love for me to say, yes, we are considering it, which we are, for the next iteration as well. So that's why those sub-working groups will be active over the next 4 years to try and get at least some of these resolved, talk about those barriers to implementation, and see what we can get ready for that next round. So it may have been there in the past for individual CAs, but not at the watershed report card level as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Catherine says it's good to see that the shoreline habitat assessment includes the St. Lawrence River, at least at Quebec border. Has there been any consideration of including St. Lawrence River and its watersheds into the Great Lakes assessment program?
I can jump in here, Rick. Most of the programs that you heard about today, of course, for Environment and Climate Change Canada are under the framework of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And so that agreement takes us to the international portion of the St. Lawrence River. So that's why you'll see the St. Lawrence River included in those assessments from the programs under the Water Quality Agreement. In the past, we did do a comparison with State of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River program to see if there were any comparable indicators that both ecosystems were using, and then could we do a common report. That was done quite a long time ago, probably about 15 or 20 years ago. And it turns out there were 5 indicators in common, and then we released a report, our findings on these common indicators, but it hasn't been done since. I guess there just wasn't, there's probably an issue with capacity to continue doing that, but we did do a look at that. And like I say, most of our programs will go to the international boundary of the St. Lawrence River under the Water Quality Agreement.
Okay, that's great. That's all the questions we have in the Q&A. So thanks again to all the panelists for your insight on those questions.
Yeah, the timing worked out really well. So that discussion, yeah, is really good, really insightful, inspiring, and definitely unpacked a ton of information this morning. I do want to take another moment to thank all the panelists for giving us their time, for sharing their knowledge, their experiences, and also the tools created for reporting on ecological health in the Great Lakes watersheds. Thank you also to the participants for your questions and your willingness to spend the morning learning with us. It's our hope that today's presentation and conversations have provided some key takeaways to implement in your own work. This webinar has been brought to you by the Latornell Conservation Symposium Steering Committee. I would like to thank all those who helped make this happen, including Jamie Jodry of Ontario Heritage Trust, Nikisha Mohammed of Conservation Ontario, and Mario Mae of Allset Inc., who were all part of the planning committee for this webinar. If you missed any of the past webinars, you can view the recordings at latornell.ca. And as I mentioned, the recording for this webinar should be posted within a few days or up to a week, and you will receive an email when it is posted. One more thing to do before you leave, if you have any feedback on our webinar series, please take a minute to complete some final poll questions. Thanks, everyone.